Chapter 28 of Miss Mackenzie, by Anthony Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Showing how the Lion was stung by the Wasp. It may be remembered that Mr Maguire, when he first made public that pretty story of the Lion and the Lamb, declared that he would give the lion no peace till that beast had disgorged his prey, and that he had pledged himself to continue the fight till he should have succeeded in bringing the lamb back to the pleasant pastures of Littlebath. But Mr Maguire found some difficulty in carrying out his pledge. He was willing enough to fight, but the weapons with which to do battle were wanting to him. The Christian Examiner, having got so far into the mess, and finding that a ready sale did in truth result from any special article as to the Lion and the Lamb, was indeed ready to go on with the libel. The Christian Examiner probably had not much to lose, but there arose a question whether fighting simply through the columns of the Christian Examiner was not almost tantamount to no fight at all. He wanted to bring an action against Sir John Ball, and to have Sir John Ball summoned into court and examined about the money, to hear some truculent barrister tell Sir John Ball that he could not conceal himself from the scorn of an indignant public behind the spangles of his parvenu baronetcy. He had a feeling that the Lion would be torn to pieces if only a properly truculent barrister could be got to fix his claws into him. But unfortunately no lawyer, not even Solomon Walker, the Low Church attorney at Littlebath, would advise him that he had any ground for an action. If, indeed, he chose to proceed against the lady for a breach of promise of marriage, then the result would depend on the evidence. In such case as that, the Low Church attorney at Littlebath was willing to take the matter up. "But Mr Maguire was, of course, aware," said Solomon Walker, "that there was a prejudice in the public mind against gentlemen appearing as parties to such suits." Mr Maguire was also aware that he could adduce no evidence of the fact beyond his own unsupported, and in such case untrue, word, and declared therefore to the attorney, in a very high tone indeed, that on no account would he take any step to harass the lady. It was simply against Sir John Ball that he wished to proceed. "Things would come out in that trial, Mr Walker," he said, "which would astonish you and all the legal world. A rapacious scheme of villainy has been conceived and brought to bear, through the stupidity of some people and the iniquity of others, which would unroll itself fold by fold as certainly as I stand here, if it were properly handled by a competent barrister in one of our courts of law." And I think that Mr Maguire believed what he was saying, and that he believed, moreover, that he was speaking the truth when he told Mr Walker that the lady had promised to marry him. Men who can succeed in deceiving no one else will succeed at last in deceiving themselves. But the lawyer told him, repeating the fact over and over again, that the thing was impracticable, that there was no means of carrying the matter so far that Sir John Ball should be made to appear in a witness box. Everything that Sir John had done he had done legally, and even at that moment of the discussion between Mr Walker and Mr Maguire, the question of the ownership of the property was being tried before a proper tribunal in London. Mr Maguire still thought Mr Walker to be wrong, thought that his attorney was a weak and ignorant man, but he acknowledged to himself the fact that he, in his unhappy position, was unable to get any more cunning attorney to take the matter in hand. But the Christian Examiner still remained to him, and that he used with diligence. From week to week there appeared in it articles attacking the Lion, stating that the Lion was still being watched, that his prey would be snatched from him at last, that the Lamb should even yet have her rights, and the like. And as the thing went on, the periodical itself and the writer of the article became courageous by habit, till things were printed which Sir John Ball found it almost impossible to bear. It was declared that he was going to desert the lamb, now that he had taken all the lamb's property, and that the lamb, shorn of all her fleece, was to be condemned to earn her bread as a common nurse in the wards of a common hospital. All which information came readily enough to Mr Maguire by the hands of Miss Colza. The papers containing these articles were always sent to Sir John Ball and to Miss Mackenzie, and the articles were always headed "The Lion and the Lamb." Miss Mackenzie, in accordance with an arrangement made to that purpose, sent the papers as soon as they came to Mr Slow; but Sir John Ball had no such ready way of freeing himself from their burden. He groaned and toiled under them, going to his lawyer with them, and imploring permission to bring an action for libel against Mr Maguire. The venom of the unclean animal's sting had gone so deep into him that, fond as he was of money, he had told his lawyer that he would not begrudge the expense if he could only punish the man who was hurting him. But the attorney, who understood something of feeling as well as something of money, begged him to be quiet, at any rate till the fate of the property should be settled. "And if you'll take my advice, Sir John, you will not notice him at all. You may be sure that he has not a shilling in the world, and that he wants you to prosecute him. When you have got damages against him, he will be out of the country." "But I shall have stopped his impudent ribaldry," said Sir John Ball. Then the lawyer tried to explain to him that no one read the ribaldry. It was of no use. Sir John read it himself, and that was enough to make him wretched. The little fable which made Sir John so unhappy had not, for some months past, appeared in any of the metropolitan newspapers; but when the legal inquiry into the proper disposition of Mr Jonathan Ball's property was over, and when it was known that, as the result of that inquiry, the will in favour of the Mackenzies was to be set aside, and the remains of the property handed over to Sir John, then that very influential newspaper, which in the early days of the question had told the story of the Lion and the Lamb, told it again, tearing indeed the Littlebath Christian Examiner into shreds for its iniquity, but speaking of the romantic misfortune of the lamb in terms which made Sir John Ball very unhappy. The fame which accrued to him from being so publicly pointed out as a lion was not fame of which he was proud; and when the writer in this very influential newspaper went on to say that the world was now looking for a termination of this wonderful story, which would make it pleasant to all parties, he was nearly beside himself in his misery. He, a man of 50, of slow habits, with none of the buoyancy of youth left in him, apt to regard himself as older than his age, who had lived with his father and mother almost on an equality in regard to habits of life, the father of a large family, of which the eldest was now himself a man. Could it be endured that such a one as he should enter upon matrimony amidst the din of public trumpets and under a halo of romance? The idea of it was frightful to him. On the very day on which the result of the legal investigation was officially communicated to him, he sat in the old study at the Cedars with two newspapers before him. In one of these there was a description of his love, which he knew was intended as furtive ridicule, and an assurance to the public that the lamb's misfortunes would all be remedied by the sweet music of the marriage bell. What right had any one to assert publicly that he intended to marry any one? In his wretchedness and anger he would have indicted this newspaper also for libel, had not his lawyer assured him that, according to law, there was no libel in stating that a man was going to be married. The other paper accused him of rapacity and dishonesty, in that he would not marry the lamb now that he had secured the lamb's fleece; so that, in truth, he had no escape on either side. For Mr Maguire, having at last ascertained that the lamb had, in very truth, lost all her fleece, was no longer desirous of any personal connection, and felt that he could best carry out his pledge by attacking the possessor of the fleece on that side. Under such circumstances, what was such a man as Sir John Ball to do? Could he marry his cousin amidst the trumpets and the halo and the doggerel poetry which would abound? Was it right that he should be made a mark for the finger of scorn? Had he done anything to deserve this punishment? And it must be remembered that from day to day his own mother, who lived with him, who sat with him late every night talking on this one subject, was always instigating him to abandon his cousin. It had been admitted between them that he was no longer bound by his offer. Margaret herself had admitted it. "Does not attempt to deny it," as Lady Ball repeated over and over again. When he had made his offer he had known nothing of Mr Maguire's offer, nor had Margaret then told him of it. Such reticence on her part of course released him from his bond. So Lady Ball argued, and against this argument her son made no demur. Indeed, it was hardly possible that he should comprehend exactly what had taken place between his cousin and Mr Maguire. His mother did not scruple to assure him that she must undoubtedly at one time have accepted the man's proposal. In answer to this, John Ball would always assert his entire reliance on his cousin's word. "She did it without knowing that she did so," Lady Ball would answer, "but in some language she must have assented." But the mother was never able to extract from the son any intimation of his intention to give up the marriage, though she used threats and tears, ridicule and argument, appeals to his pride and appeals to his pocket. He never said that he certainly would marry her. He never said so, at least, after that night on which Margaret in her bedroom had told him her story with reference to Mr Maguire. But neither did he ever say that he certainly would not marry her. Lady Ball gathered from all his words a conviction that he would be glad to be released, if he could be released by any act on Margaret's behalf, and therefore she had made her attempt on Margaret. With what success the reader will, I hope, remember. Margaret, when she accepted her cousin's offer, had been specially bidden by him to be firm. This bidding she obeyed, and on that side there was no hope at all for Lady Ball. I fear there was much of cowardice on Sir John's part. He had in truth forgiven Margaret any offence that she had committed in reference to Mr Maguire. She had accepted his offer while another offer was still dragging on an existence after a sort, and she had not herself been the first to tell him of these circumstances. There had been offence to him in this, but that offence had, in truth, been forgiven. Had there been no Littlebath Christian Examiner, no tale of the Lion and the Lamb, no publicity and no ridicule, he would quietly have walked off with his cousin to some church, having gone through all preliminary ceremonies in the most silent manner possible for them, and would have quietly got himself married, and have carried Margaret home with him. Now that his father was dead, and that his uncle Jonathan's money had come to him, his pecuniary cares were comparatively light, and he believed that he could be very happy with Margaret and his children. But then to be pointed at daily as a lion, and to be asked by all his acquaintances after the lamb! It must be owned that he was a coward, but are not most men cowards in such matters as that? But now the trial was over. The money was his own. Margaret was left standing without a shilling in the world, and it was quite necessary that he should make up his mind. He had once told his lawyer, in his premature joy, on that very day on which Mr Maguire had come to the Cedars, that everything was to be made smooth by a marriage between himself and the disinherited heiress. He had since told the lawyer that something had occurred which might, perhaps, alter this arrangement. After that the lawyer had asked no questions about the marriage; but when he communicated to his client the final intelligence that Jonathan Ball's money was at his client's disposal, he said that it would be well to arrange what should be done on Miss Mackenzie's behalf. Sir John Ball had assumed very plainly a look of vexation when the question was put to him. "I promised Mr Slow that I would ask you," said the lawyer. "Mr Slow is of course anxious for his client." "It is my business, and not Mr Slow's," said Sir John Ball, "and you may tell him that I say so." Then there had been a moment's silence, and Sir John had felt himself to be wrong. "Pray tell him also," said Sir John, "that I am very grateful to him for his solicitude about my cousin, and that I fully appreciate his admirable conduct both to her and me throughout all this affair. When I have made up my mind what shall be done, I will let him know at once." As he walked down from his lawyer's chambers in Bedford Row to the railway station, he thought of all this, and thought also of those words which Mrs Mackenzie had spoken to him in the bazaar. "You have no right to scold him yet," she had said to Margaret. Of course he had understood what they meant, and of course Margaret had understood them also. And he had not been at all angry when they were spoken. Margaret had been so prettily dressed, and had looked so fresh and nice, that at that moment he had forgotten all his annoyances in his admiration, and had listened to Mrs Mackenzie's cunning speech, not without confusion, but without any immediate desire to contradict its necessary inference. A moment or two afterwards the harpies had been upon him, and then he had gone off in his anger. Poor Margaret had been unable to distinguish between the effects produced by the speech and by the harpies, but Mrs Mackenzie had been more clever, and had consequently predicted her cousin's speedy promotion in the world's rank. Sir John, as he went home, made up his mind to one of two alternatives. He would either marry his cousin, or have Jonathan Ball's money with her. He wanted to marry her, and he wanted to keep the money. He wanted to marry her especially since he had seen how nice she looked in black freckled muslin. But he wanted to marry her in silence, without any clash of absurd trumpets, without ridicule moving leading articles, and fingers pointed at the triumphant lion. He made up his mind to one of those alternatives, and resolved that he would settle which on that very night. His mind should be made up and told to his mother before he went to bed. Nevertheless, when the girls and Jack were gone, and he was left alone with Lady Ball, his mind had as yet been made up to nothing. His mother gave him no peace on this subject. It was she who began the conversation on this occasion. "John," she said, "the time has come for me to settle the question of my residence." Now the house at Twickenham was the property of the present baronet, but Lady Ball had a jointure of £500 a year out of her late husband's estate. It had always been intended that the mother should continue to live with her son and grandchildren in the very probable event of her being left a widow, and it was felt by them that their means were not large enough to permit, with discretion, separate households. But Lady Ball had declared more than once, with extreme vehemence, that nothing should induce her to live at the Cedars if Margaret Mackenzie should be made mistress of the house. "Has the time come especially to day?" he asked in reply. "I think we may say it has come especially to day. We know now that you have got this increase to your income, and nothing is any longer in doubt that we cannot ourselves settle. I need not say that my dearest wish is to remain here, but you know my mind upon that subject." "I cannot see any possible reason for your going." "Nor can I, except the one. I suppose you know yourself what you mean to do about your cousin. Everybody knows what you ought to do after the disgraceful things that have been put into all the newspapers." "That has not been Margaret's fault." "I am by no means so sure of that. Indeed, I think it has been her fault. And now that she has made herself notorious by being at this bazaar, and by having herself called a ridiculous name by everybody, nothing will make me believe but what she likes it." "You are ready to believe any evil of her, mother, and yet it is not 2 years since you yourself wished me to marry her." Things are very different since that, very different indeed. And I did not know her then as I do now, or I should never have thought of such a thing, let her have had all the money in the world. She had not misbehaved herself then with that horrible curate." "She has not misbehaved herself now," said the son in an angry voice. "Yes, she has, John," said the mother, in a voice still more angry. "That's a matter for me to judge. She has not misbehaved herself in my eyes. It is a great misfortune for us both, the conduct of this man, but I won't allow it to be said that it was her fault." "Very well. Then I suppose I may arrange to go. I did not think, John, that I should be turned out of your father's house so soon after your father's death. I did not, indeed." Thereupon Lady Ball got out her handkerchief, and her son perceived that real tears were running down her face. "Nobody has ever spoken of your going except yourself, mother." "I won't live in the house with her." "And what would you have me do? Would you wish me to let her go her way and starve by herself?" "No, John, certainly not. I think you should see that she wants for nothing. She could live with her sister-in-law, and have the interest of the money that the Rubbs took from her. It was your money." "I have explained to you over and over again, mother, that has already been made over to Mrs Tom Mackenzie, and that would not have been at all sufficient. Indeed, I have altogether made up my mind upon that. When the lawyers and all the expenses are paid, there will still be about 800 a year. I shall share it with her." "John!" "That is my intention, and therefore, if I were to marry her, I should get an additional income of 400 a year for myself and my children." "You don't mean it, John?" "Indeed I do, mother. I'm sure the world would expect me to do as much as that." "The world expect you! And are you to rob your children, John, because the world expects it? I never heard of such a thing. Give away 400 a year, merely because you are afraid of those wretched newspapers! I did expect you would have more courage." "If I do not do one, mother, I shall do the other, certainly." "Then I must beg you to tell me which you mean to do. If you gave her half of all that is coming to you, of course I must remain here, because you could not live here without me. Your income would be quite insufficient. But you do owe it to me to tell me at once what I am to do." To this her son made no immediate answer, but sat with his elbow on the table and his head upon his hand, looking moodily at the fireplace. He did not wish to commit himself, if he could possibly avoid it. "John, I must insist upon an answer," said his mother. "I have a right to expect an answer." "You must do what you like, mother, independently of me. If you think that you can live here on your income, I will go away, and you shall have the place." "That's nonsense, John. Of course you want a large house for the children, and I, if I must be alone, shall only want one room for myself. What should I do with the house?" Then there was silence again for a while. "I will give you a final answer on Saturday," he said at last. "I shall see Margaret before Saturday." After that he took his candle and went to bed. It was then Tuesday, and Lady Ball was obliged to be contented with the promise thus made to her. On Wednesday he did nothing. On the Thursday morning he received a letter which nearly drove him mad. It was addressed to him at the office of the Shadrach Fire Insurance Company, and it reached him there. It was as follows: Littlebath, June, 186 . Sir, you are no doubt fully aware of all the efforts which I have made during the last 6 months to secure from your grasp the fortune which did belong to my dearest friend, Margaret Mackenzie. For as my dearest friend I shall ever regard her, though she and I have been separated by machinations of the nature of which she, as I am fully sure, has never been aware. I now ascertain that some of the inferior law courts have, under what pressure I know not, set aside the will which was made 20 years ago in favour of the Mackenzie family, and given to you the property which did belong to them. That a superior court would reverse the judgment, I believe there is little doubt; but whether or no the means exist for me to bring the matter before the higher tribunals of the country, I am not yet aware. Very probably I may have no such power, and in such case Margaret Mackenzie is to day, through your means, a beggar. Since this matter has been before the public, you have ingeniously contrived to mitigate the wrath of public opinion by letting it be supposed that you proposed to marry the lady whose wealth you were seeking to obtain by legal quibbles. You have made your generous intentions very public, and have created a romance that has been, I must say, but little becoming to your age. If all be true that I heard when I last saw Miss Mackenzie at Twickenham, you have gone through some ceremony of proposing to her. But, as I understand, that joke is now thought to have been carried far enough, and as the money is your own, you intend to enjoy yourself as a lion, leaving the lamb to perish in the wilderness. Now I call upon you to assert, under your own name and with your own signature, what are your intentions with reference to Margaret Mackenzie. Her property, at any rate for the present, is yours. Do you intend to make her your wife, or do you not? And if such be your intention, when do you propose that the marriage shall take place, and where? I reserve to myself the right to publish this letter and your answer to it, and of course shall publish the fact if your cowardice prevents you from answering it. Indeed, nothing shall induce me to rest in this matter till I know that I have been the means of restoring to Margaret Mackenzie the means of a decent livelihood. I have the honour to be, sir, your very humble servant, Jeremiah Maguire. Sir John Ball, Baronet, etc., etc., Shadrach Fire Office. Sir John, when he had read this, was almost wild with agony and anger. He threw up his hands with dismay as he walked along the passages of the Shadrach office, and fulminated mental curses against the wasp that was able to sting him so deeply. What should he do to the man? As for answering the letter, that was of course out of the question; but the reptile would carry out his threat of publishing the letter, and then the whole question of his marriage would be discussed in the public prints. An idea came across him that a free press was bad and rotten from the beginning to the end. This creature was doing him a terrible injury, was goading him almost to death, and yet he could not punish him. He was a clergyman, and could not be beaten and kicked, or even fired at with a pistol. As for prosecuting the miscreant, had not his own lawyer told him over and over again that such a prosecution was the very thing which the miscreant desired? And then the additional publicity of such a prosecution, and the twang of false romance which would follow, and the horrid alliteration of the story of the two beasts, and all the ridicule of the incidents, crowded upon his mind, and he walked forth from the Shadrach office among the throngs of the city, a wretched and almost despairing man. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Chapter 29. A friend in need is a friend indeed. When the work of the bazaar was finished, all the four Mackenzie ladies went home to Mrs Mackenzie's house in Cavendish Square, very tired, eager for tea, and resolved that nothing more should be done that evening. There should be no dressing for dinner, no going out, nothing but idleness, tea, lamb chops, and gossip about the day's work. Mr Mackenzie was down at the house, and there was no occasion for any domestic energy. And thus the evening was passed. How Mrs Chaucer Munro and the loud bevy fared among them, or how old Lady Ware and her daughters, or the poor dear bothered Duchess, or Mr. Manfred Smith, or the kings and heroes who had appeared in paint and armour, cannot be told. I fear that the Mackenzie verdict about the bazaar in general was not favourable, and that they agreed among themselves to abstain from such enterprises of charity in future. It concerns us now chiefly to know that our Griselda held up her head well throughout that evening, and made herself comfortable and at ease among her cousins, although it was already known to her that the legal decision had gone against her in the great case of Ball v. Mackenzie. But had that decision been altogether in her favour, the result would not have been so favourable to her spirits, as had been that little speech made by Mrs Mackenzie as to her having no right as yet to scold Sir John for his extravagance. That little speech made in good humour, and apparently accepted in good humour even by him. But on that evening Mrs Mackenzie was not able to speak to Margaret about her prospects, or to lecture her on the expediency of regarding the niceness of her dress in Sir John's presence, because of the two other cousins. The two other cousins no doubt knew all the story of the Lion and the Lamb, and talked to their sister-in-law Clara of their other cousin Griselda behind Griselda's back, and were no doubt very anxious that Griselda should become a baronet's wife. But among so large a party there was no opportunity for confidential advice. On the next morning Mrs Mackenzie and Margaret were together, and then Mrs Mackenzie began. "Margaret, my dear," said she, "that bonnet I gave you has been worth its weight in gold." "It cost nearly as much," said Margaret, "for it was very expensive and very light." "Or in bank notes either, because it has showed him and me and everybody else that you needn't be a dowdy unless you please. No man wishes to marry a dowdy, you know." "I suppose I was a dowdy when he asked me." "I wasn't there, and I didn't know you then, and can't say. But I do know that he liked the way you looked yesterday. Now, of course, he'll be coming here before long." "I dare say he won't come here again the whole summer." "If he did not, I should send for him." "Oh, Mrs Mackenzie!" "And oh, Griselda! Why should I not send for him? You don't suppose I'm going to let this kind of thing go on from month to month till that old woman at the Cedars has contrived to carry her point? Certainly not. Now that the matter is settled, of course I shall not go on staying here." "Not after you're married, my dear. We couldn't well take in Sir John and the children. Besides, we shall be going down to Scotland for the grouse. But I mean you shall be married out of this house. Don't look so astonished. Why not? There's plenty of time before the end of July." "I don't think he means anything of the kind. I don't indeed." "Then he must be the queerest man that ever I met, and I should say about the falsest and most heartless also. But whether he means to do that or does not, he must mean to do something. You don't suppose he'll take all your fortune away from you, and then leave you without coming to say a word to you about it? If you had disputed the matter and put him to all manner of expense, if, in short, you had been enemies throughout it all, that might have been possible. But you have been such a veritable lamb, giving your fleece to the shearer so meekly, such a true Griselda, that if he were to leave you in that way, no one would ever speak to him again." "But you forget Lady Ball." "No, I don't. He'll have a disagreeable scene with his mother, and I don't pretend to guess what will be the end of that. But when he has done with his mother he'll come here. He must do it. He has no alternative. And when he does come, I want you to look your best. Believe me, my dear, there would be no muslins in the world and no starch, if it was not intended that people should make themselves look as nice as possible." "Young people," suggested Margaret. "Young people, as you call them, can look well without muslin and without starch. Such things were intended for just such persons as you and me. And as for me, I make it a rule to take the goods the gods provide me." Mrs Mackenzie's philosophy was not without its result, and her prophecy certainly came true. A few days passed by and no lover came, but early on the Friday morning after the bazaar, Margaret, who at the moment was in her own room, was told that Sir John was below in the drawing room with Mrs Mackenzie. He had already been there some little time, the servant said, and Mrs Mackenzie had sent up with her love to know if Miss Mackenzie would come down. Would she go down? Of course she would go to her cousin. She was no coward. Indeed, a true Griselda can hardly be a coward. So she made up her mind to go to her cousin and hear her fate. The last 24 hours had been very bitter with John Ball. What was he to do, walking about with that man's letter in his pocket, with that reptile's venom still curdling through his veins? On that Thursday morning, as he went towards his office, he had made up his mind, as he thought, to go to Margaret and bid her choose her own destiny. She should become his wife, or have half of Jonathan Ball's remaining fortune, as she might herself elect. She refused me, he said to himself, when the money was all hers. Why should she wish to come to such a house as mine, to marry a dull husband, and undertake the charge of a lot of children? She shall choose herself. And then he thought of her as he had seen her at the bazaar, and began to flatter himself that, in spite of his dulness and his children, she would choose to become his wife. He was making some scheme as to his mother's life, proposing that 2 of his girls should live with her, and that she should be near to him, when the letter from Mr Maguire was put into his hands. How was he to marry his cousin after that? If he were to do so, would not that wretch at Littlebath declare, through all the provincial and metropolitan newspapers, that he had compelled the marriage? That letter would be published in the very column that told of the wedding. But yet he must decide. He must do something. They who read this will probably declare that he was a weak fool to regard anything that such a one as Mr Maguire could say of him. He was not a fool, but he was so far weak and foolish, and in such matters such men are weak and foolish, and often cowardly. It was, however, absolutely necessary that he should do something. He was as well aware as was Mrs Mackenzie that it was essentially his duty to see his cousin, now that the question of law between them had been settled. Even if he had no thought of again asking her to be his wife, he could not confide to any one else the task of telling her what was to be her fate. Her conduct to him in the matter of the property had been exemplary, and it was incumbent on him to thank her for her generous forbearance. He had pledged himself also to give his mother a final answer on Saturday. On the Friday morning, therefore, he knocked at the Mackenzies' house door in Cavendish Square, and soon found himself alone with Mrs Mackenzie. I do not know that even then he had come to any fixed purpose. What he would himself have preferred would have been permission to postpone any action as regards his cousin for another 6 months, and to have been empowered to use that time in crushing Mr Maguire out of existence. But this might not be so, and therefore he went to Cavendish Square that he might there decide his fate. "You want to see Margaret, no doubt," said Mrs Mackenzie, "that you may tell her that her ruin is finally completed." And as she thus spoke of her cousin's ruin, she smiled her sweetest smile, and put on her pleasantest look. "Yes, I do want to see her presently," he said. Mrs Mackenzie had stood up as though she were about to go in quest of her cousin, but had sat down again when the word presently was spoken. She was by no means averse to having a few words of conversation about Margaret, if Sir John should wish it. Sir John, I fear, had merely used the word through some instinctive idea that he might thereby stave off the difficulty for a while. "Don't you think she looked very well at the bazaar?" said Mrs Mackenzie. "Very well indeed," he answered; "very well. I can't say I liked the place."
Nor any of us, I can assure you. Only one must do that sort of thing sometimes, you know. Margaret was very much admired there. So much has been said of this singular story about her fortune, that people have, of course, talked more of her than they would otherwise have done. "That has been a great misfortune," said Sir John, frowning. "It has been a misfortune, but it has been one of those things that can't be helped. I don't think you have any cause to complain, for Margaret has behaved as no other woman ever did behave, I think. Her conduct has been perfect." "I don't complain of her." "As for the rest, you must settle that with the world yourself. I don't care for any one beyond her. But for my part, I think it is best to let those things die away of themselves. After all, what does it matter, as long as one does nothing to be ashamed of oneself? People can't break any bones by their talking." "Wouldn't you think it very unpleasant, Mrs Mackenzie, to have your name brought up in the newspapers?" "Upon my word, I don't think I should care about it, as long as my husband stood by me. What is it, after all? People say that you and Margaret are the lion and the lamb. What's the harm of being called a lion or a lamb? As long as people are not made to believe that you have behaved badly, that you have been false or cruel, I can't see that it comes to much. One does not, of course, wish to have newspaper articles written about one." "No, indeed." "But they can't break your bones, nor can they make the world think you dishonest, as long as you take care that you are honest. Now, in this matter, I take it for granted that you and Margaret are going to make a match of it." "Has she told you so?" Mrs Mackenzie paused a moment to collect her thoughts before she answered, but it was only for a moment, and Sir John Ball hardly perceived that she had ceased to speak. "No," she said, "she has not told me so, but I have told her that it must be so." "And she does not wish it?" "Do you want me to tell a lady's secret? But in such a case as this the truth is always best. She does wish it, with all her heart, as much as any woman ever wished for anything. You need have no doubt about her loving you." "Of course, Mrs Mackenzie, I should take care in any case that she were provided for amply. If a single life will suit her best, she shall have half of all that she ever thought to be her own." "And do you wish it to be so?" "I have not said that, Mrs Mackenzie. But it may be that I should wish her to have the choice fairly in her own power. Then I can tell you at once which she would choose. Your offer is very generous. It is more than generous. But, Sir John, a single life will not suit her. And my belief is, that were you to offer her the money without your hand, she would not take a farthing of it." "She must have some provision." "She will take none from you but the one. And you need be under no doubt whatsoever that she will take that without a moment's doubt as to her own future happiness. And, Sir John, I think you would have the best wife that I know anywhere among my acquaintance." Then she stopped, and he sat silent, making no reply. "Shall I send to her now?" said Mrs Mackenzie. "I suppose you might as well," said Sir John. Then Mrs Mackenzie got up and left the room, but she did not herself go up to her cousin. She felt that she could not see Margaret without saying something of what had passed between herself and Sir John, and that it would be better that nothing should be said. So she went away to her own room and dispatched her maid to send the lamb to the lion. Nevertheless, it was not without compunction, like some twang of feminine conscience, that Mrs Mackenzie gave up this opportunity of saying some last important word, and perhaps doing some last important little act with regard to those nicenesses of which she thought perhaps too much. Mrs Mackenzie's philosophy was not without its truth, but a man of 50 should not be made to marry a woman by muslin and starch, if he be not prepared to marry her on other considerations. When the message came, Margaret thought nothing of the muslin and starch. The bonnet that had been worth its weight in gold, and the black freckled dress, were all forgotten. But she thought of the words which her cousin John had spoken to her as soon as they had got through the little gate into the grounds of the Cedars, when they had walked back together from the railway station at Twickenham, and she remembered that she had then pledged herself to be firm. If he alluded to the offer he had then made, and repeated it, she would throw herself into his arms at once, and tell him that she would serve him with all her heart and all her strength as long as God might leave them together. But she was quite as strongly determined to accept from him for herself no other kind of provision. That money, which for a short while had been hers, was now his, and she could have no claim upon him unless he gave her the claim of a wife. After what had passed between them, she would not be the recipient of his charity. Certain words had been written and spoken, from which she had gathered the existence in Mr Slow's mind of some such plan as this. His client should lose her cause meekly and graciously, and should then have a claim for alms. That had been the idea on which Mr Slow had worked. She had long made up her mind that Mr Slow should be taught to know her better, if the day for offering alms should ever come. Perhaps it had come now. She took up a little scarf that she wore ordinarily, and folded it tight across her shoulders, quite forgetful of muslin and starch, as she descended to the drawing room, in order that this question might be solved for her. Sir John met her almost at the door as she entered. "I'm afraid you've been expecting me to come sooner," he said. "No, indeed. I was not quite sure that you would come at all." "Oh yes, I was certain to come. You have hardly received as yet any official notification that your cause has been lost." "It was not my cause, John," she said, smiling, "and I received no other notification than what I got through Mrs Mackenzie. Indeed, as you know, I have regarded this law business as nonsense all through. Since what you and Mr Slow told me, I have known that the property was yours." "But it was quite necessary to have a judgment." "I suppose so, and there's an end of it. I, for one, am not in the least disappointed, if it will give you any comfort to know that. I don't believe that any other woman in England would have lost her fortune with the equanimity that you have shown." She could not explain to him that, in the first days of dismay caused by that misfortune, he had given her such consolation as to make her forget the loss, and that her subsequent misery had been caused by the withdrawal of that consolation. She could not tell him that the very memory of her money had been, as it were, drowned by other hopes in life, by other hopes and by other despair. But when he praised her for her equanimity, she thought of this. She still smiled as she heard his praise. "I suppose I ought to return the compliment," she said, "and declare that no cousin who had been kept so long out of his money ever behaved so well as you have done. I can assure you that I have thought of it very often, of the injustice that has been involuntarily done to you." "It has been unjust, has it not?" said he, piteously, thinking of his injuries. "So much of it has gone into that oilcloth business, and all for nothing." "I'm glad, at any rate, that Walter's share did not go." He knew that this was not the kind of conversation which he had desired to commence, and that it must be changed before anything could be settled. So he shook himself and began again. "And now, Margaret, as the lawyers have finished their part of the business, ours must begin." She had been standing hitherto, and had felt herself to be strong enough to stand; but at the sound of these words her knees had become weak under her, and she found a retreat upon the sofa. Of course she said nothing as he came and stood over her. "I hope you have understood," he continued, "that while all this was going on I could propose no arrangement of any kind." "I know you have been very much troubled." "Indeed I have. It seems that any blackguard has a right to publish any lies that he likes about any one in any of the newspapers. and that nobody can do anything to protect himself. Sometimes I have thought that it would drive me mad." But he again perceived that he was getting out of the right course in thus dwelling upon his own injuries. He had come there to alleviate her misfortunes, not to talk about his own. "It is no good, however, talking about all that; is it, Margaret?" "It will cease now, will it not?" "I cannot say. I fear not. Whichever way I turn, they abuse me for what I do. What business is it of theirs?" "You mean their absurd story calling you a lion?" "Don't talk of it, Margaret." Then Margaret was again silent. She by no means wished to talk of the story, if he would only leave it alone. "And now about you." Then he came and sat beside her, and she put her hand back behind the cushion on the sofa so as to save herself from trembling in his presence. She need not have cared much, for let her tremble ever so much, he had then no capacity for perceiving it. "Come, Margaret, I want to do what is best for us both. How shall it be?" "John, you have children, and you should do what is best for them." Then there was a pause again, and when he spoke, after a while, he was looking down at the floor and poking among the pattern on the carpet with his stick. "Margaret, when I first asked you to marry me, you refused me." "I did," said she, "and then all the property was mine." "But afterwards you said you would have me." "Yes, and when you asked me the second time, I had nothing. I know all that." "I thought nothing about the money then. I mean that I never thought you refused me because you were rich, and took me because you were poor. I was not at all unhappy about that when we were walking round the shrubbery. But when I thought you had cared for that man—" "I had never cared for him," said Margaret, withdrawing her hand from behind the pillow in her energy, and feeling no longer that she might tremble. "I had never cared for him. He is a false man, and told untruths to my aunt." "Yes, he is a liar, a damnable liar. That is true, at any rate." "He is beneath your notice, John, and beneath mine. I will not speak of him." Sir John, however, had an idea that when he felt the wasp's venom through his blood, the wasp could not be altogether beneath his notice. "The question is," said he, speaking between his teeth and hardly pronouncing his words, "the question is whether you care for me." "I do," said she, turning round upon him, and as she did so our Griselda took both his hands in hers. "I do, John, I do care for you. I love you better than all the world besides. Whom else have I to love at all? If you choose to think it mean of me, now that I am so poor, I cannot help it. But who was it told me to be firm? Who was it told me? Who was it told me?" Lady Ball had lost her game, and Mrs Mackenzie had been a true prophet. Mrs Mackenzie had been one of those prophets who knew how to assist the accomplishment of their own prophecies, and Lady Ball had played her game with very indifferent skill. Sir John endeavoured to say a word as to that other alternative that he had to offer, but the lamb was not lamb-like enough to listen to it. I doubt even whether Margaret knew, when at night she thought over the affairs of the day, that any such offer had been made to her. During the rest of the interview she was by far the greatest talker, and she would not rest till she had made him swear that he believed her when she said that both in rejecting him and accepting him she had been guided simply by her affection. "You know, John," she said, "a woman can't love a man all at once." They had been together for the best part of 2 hours when Mrs Mackenzie knocked at the door. "May I come in?" "Oh yes," said Margaret. "And may I ask a question?" She knew by the tone of her cousin's voice that no question could come amiss. "You must ask him," said Margaret, coming to her and kissing her. "But first of all," said Mrs Mackenzie, shutting the door and assuming a very serious countenance, "I have news of my own to tell. There is a gentleman downstairs in the dining room who has sent up word that he wants to see me. He says he is a clergyman." Then Sir John Ball ceased to smile and look foolish, but doubled his fist and went towards the door. "Who is it?" said Margaret, whispering. "I have not heard his name, but from the servant's account of him I have not much doubt myself. I suppose he comes from Littlebath. You can go down to him if you like, Sir John, but I would not advise it." "No," said Margaret, clinging to his arm. "You shall not go down. What good can you do? He is beneath you. If you beat him he will have the law of you, and he is a clergyman. If you do not, he will only revile you, and make you wretched." Thus, between the two ladies, the baronet was restrained. It was Mr Maguire. Having learned from his ally, Miss Colza, that Margaret was staying with her cousins in Cavendish Square, he had resolved upon calling on Mrs Mackenzie, and forcing his way, if possible, into Margaret's presence. Things were not going well with him at Littlebath, and in his despair he had thought that the best chance to him of carrying on the fight lay in this direction. Then there was a course of embassies between the dining room and drawing room in the Mackenzie mansion. The servant was sent to ask the gentleman his name, and the gentleman sent up to say that he was a clergyman, that his name was not known to Mrs Mackenzie, but that he wanted to see her most particularly for a few minutes on very special business. Then the servant was despatched to ask him whether he was the Reverend Jeremiah Maguire of Littlebath, and under this compulsion he sent back word that such was his designation. He was then told to go. Upon that he wrote a note to Mrs Mackenzie, setting forth that he had a private communication to make, much to the advantage of her cousin, Miss Margaret Mackenzie. He was again told to go, and then told again that if he did not leave the house at once the assistance of the police would be obtained. Then he went. "And it was frightful to behold him," said the servant, coming up for the 10th time. But the servant no doubt enjoyed the play, and on one occasion presumed the remark that he did not think any reference to the police was necessary. "Such a game as we've had up," he said to the coachman that afternoon in the kitchen. And the game that they had in the drawing room was not a bad game either. When Mr Maguire would not go, the two women joined in laughing, till at last the tears ran down Mrs Mackenzie's face. "Only think of our being kept prisoners here by a one-eyed clergyman." "He has got 2 eyes," said Margaret. "If he had 10, he shan't see us." And at last Sir John laughed, and as he laughed he came and stood near Margaret, and once he got his arm round her waist, and Griselda was very happy. At the present moment she was quite indifferent to Mr Maguire and any mode of fighting that he might adopt. Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Miss Mackenzie, by Anthony Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 30. Conclusion. Things had not been going well with Mr Maguire when, as a last chance, he attempted to force an entrance into Mrs Mackenzie's drawing room. Things indeed had been going very badly with him. Mr Stumfold at Littlebath had had an interview with the editor of the Christian Examiner, and had made that provincial Jupiter understand that he must drop the story of the Lion and the Lamb. There had been more than enough of it, Mr Stumfold thought, and if it were continued, Mr Stumfold would make Littlebath too hot to hold the Christian Examiner. That was the full meaning of Mr Stumfold's threat, and as the editor knew Mr Stumfold's power, the editor wisely turned a cold shoulder upon Mr Maguire. When Mr Maguire came to the editor with his letter for publication, the editor declared that he should be happy to insert it as an advertisement. Then there had been a little scene between Mr Maguire and the editor, and Mr Maguire had left the editorial office shaking the dust from off his feet. But he was a persistent man, and having ascertained that Miss Colza was possessed of some small share in her brother's business in the city, he thought it expedient to betake himself again to London. He did so, as we have seen, and with some very faint hope of obtaining collateral advantage for himself, and some stronger hope that he might still be able to do an injury to Sir John Ball, he went to the Mackenzies' house in Cavendish Square. There his success was not great, and from that time forward the wasp had no further power of inflicting stings upon the lion whom he had persecuted. But some further annoyance he did give to Griselda. He managed to induce Mrs Tom Mackenzie to take him in as a lodger in Gower Street, and Margaret very nearly ran into his way in her anxiety to befriend her sister-in-law. Luckily she heard from Mr Rubb that he was there on the very day on which he had intended to visit Gower Street. Poor Mrs Mackenzie got the worst of it, for of course Mr Maguire did not pay for his lodgings. But he did marry Miss Colza, and in some way got himself instituted at a chapel at Islington. There we will leave him, not trusting much in his connubial bliss, but faintly hoping that his teaching may be favourable to the faith and morals of his new flock. Of Mr Samuel Rubb, junior, we must say a few words. His first acquaintance with our heroine was not made under circumstances favourable to him. In that matter of the loan he departed very widely from the precept that honesty is the best policy. And when I feel that our Margaret was at one time really in danger of becoming Mrs Rubb, that in her ignorance of the world, in the dark gropings of her social philosophy, amidst the difficulties of her solitude, she had not known whether she could do better with herself and her future years than give herself and them and her money to Mr Samuel Rubb, I tremble as I look back upon her danger. It has been said of women that they have an insane desire for matrimony. I believe that the desire, even if it be as general as is here described, is not insanity. But when I see such a woman as Margaret Mackenzie in danger from such a man as Samuel Rubb, junior, I am driven to fear that there may sometimes be a maniacal tendency. But Samuel Rubb was by no means a bad man. He first hankered after the woman's money, but afterwards he had loved the woman; and my female reader, if she agrees with me, will feel that the virtue covers a multitude of sins. And he was true to the promise that he made about the loan. He did pay the interest of the money regularly to Mrs Mackenzie in Gower Street, and after a while was known in that house as the recognised lover of Mary Jane, the eldest daughter. In this way it came to pass that he occasionally saw the lady to whose hand he had aspired; for Margaret, when she was assured that Mr Maguire and his bride were never likely to be seen in that locality, did not desert her nephews and nieces in Gower Street. But we must go back to Sir John Ball. As soon as the coast was clear in Cavendish Square, he took his leave of Margaret. Mrs Mackenzie had left the room, desiring to speak a word to him alone as he came down. "I shall tell my mother to night," he said to Margaret. "You know that all this is not exactly as she wishes it." "John," she said, "if it is as you wish it, I have no right to think of anything beyond that." "It is as I wish it," said he. "Then tell my aunt, with my love, that I shall hope that she will receive me as her daughter." Then they parted, and Margaret was left alone to congratulate herself over her success. "Sir John," said Mrs Mackenzie, calling him into the drawing room, "you must hear my congratulations. You must indeed." "Thank you," said he, looking foolish. "You are very good." "And so is she. She is what you may really call good. She is as good as gold. I know a woman when I see her. I know that for one like her there are 50 not fit to hold a candle to her. She has nothing mean or little about her. Nothing. They may call her a lamb, but she can be a lioness too, when there is an occasion." "I know that she is steadfast." "That she is, and honest, and warm hearted. And oh, Sir John, I am so happy that it is all to be made right and nice and comfortable. It would have been very sad if she hadn't gone with the money; would it not?" "I should not have taken the money, not all of it." "And she would not have taken any. She would not have taken a penny of it; though we need not mind that now, need we? But there is one thing I want to say to you. You must not think I am interfering." "I shan't think that, after all that you have done." "I want her to be married from here. It would be quite proper, wouldn't it? Mr Mackenzie is a little particular about the grouse, because there is to be a large party at Incharrow; but up to the 10th of August you and she should fix any day you like." Sir John showed by his countenance that he was somewhat taken aback. The 10th of August! And here they were, far advanced into June. When he had left his home that morning he had not fully made up his mind whether he meant to marry his cousin or not. And now, within a few hours, he was being confined to weeks and days. Mrs Mackenzie saw what was passing in his mind, but she was not a woman to be driven easily from her purpose. "You see," she said, "there is so much to think of. What is Margaret to do if we leave her in London when we go down? And it would really be better for her to be married from her cousin's house. It would indeed. Lady Ball would like it better, I'm sure she would, than if she were to be living alone in town, in lodgings. There is always a way of doing things, isn't there? And Walter's sisters, her own cousins, could be her bridesmaids, you know." Sir John said that he would think about it. "I haven't spoken to her, of course," said Mrs Mackenzie, "but I shall now." Sir John, as he went eastwards into the city, did think about it; and before he had reached his own house that evening, he had brought himself to regard Mrs Mackenzie's scheme in a favourable light. He was not blind to the advantage of taking his wife from a house in Cavendish Square, instead of from lodgings in Arundel Street. He was aware that his mother would not be blind to that advantage either. He did not hope to be able to reconcile her to his marriage at once, and perhaps he entertained some faint idea that for the first 6 months of his new married life the Cedars would be quite as pleasant without his mother as with her. But a final reconciliation would be more easy if he and his wife had the Mackenzies of Incharrow to back them, than it could be without such influence. And as for the London gossip of the thing, the finale to the romance of the Lion and the Lamb, it would be sure to come sooner or later. Let them have their odious joke, and have done with it. "Mother," he said, as soon as he could find himself alone with Lady Ball that day, not waiting for the midnight conference, "Mother, I may as well tell you at once. I have proposed to Margaret Mackenzie again to day." "Oh, very well." "And she has accepted me." "Accepted you! Of course she has. Jumped at the chance, no doubt. What else should a pauper do?" "Mother, that is ungenerous." "She did not accept you when she had got anything." "If I can reconcile myself to that, surely you can do so. The matter is settled now, and I think I have done the best in my power for myself and my children. And as for your poor mother, she may go and die anywhere." "Mother, that is unfair. As long as I have a house over my head you shall share it, if you please to do so. if it suits you to go elsewhere, I will be with you as often as may be possible. I hope, however, you will not leave us." "That I shall certainly do." "Then I hope you will not go far from me." "And when is it to be?" said his mother, after a pause. "I cannot name any day, but some time before the 10th of August." "Before the 10th of August! Why, that is at once. Oh, John! And your father not dead a year!" "Margaret has a home now, with her cousins in Cavendish Square; but she cannot stay there after they go to Scotland. It will be for her welfare that she should be married from their house. And as for my father's death, I know that you do not suspect me of disrespect to his memory." And in this way it was settled at the Cedars, and his mother's question about the time drove him to the resolution which he himself had not reached. When next he was in Cavendish Square, he asked Margaret whether she could be ready so soon, and she replied that she would be ready on any day that he told her to be ready. Thus it was settled, and with a moderate amount of nuptial festivity the marriage feast was prepared in Mrs Mackenzie's house. Margaret was surprised to find how many dear friends she had who were interested in her welfare. Miss Baker wrote to her most affectionately, and Miss Todd was warm in her congratulations. But the attention which perhaps surprised her most was a warm letter of sisterly affection from Mrs Stumfold, in which that lady rejoiced with an exceeding joy in that the machinations of a certain wolf in sheep's clothing had been unsuccessful. "My anxiety that you should not be sacrificed I once before evinced to you," said Mrs Stumfold, "and within the last 2 months Mr Stumfold has been at work to put an end to the scurrilous writings which that wolf in sheep's clothing has been putting into the newspapers." Then Mrs Stumfold very particularly desired to be remembered to Sir John Ball, and expressed a hope that at some future time she might have the honour of being made acquainted with "the worthy baronet." They were married in the first week in August, and our modern Griselda went through the ceremony with much grace. That there was much grace about Sir John Ball I cannot say, but gentlemen, when they get married at 50, are not expected to be graceful. "There, my Lady Ball," said Mrs Mackenzie, whispering into her cousin's ear before they left the church, "now my prophecy has come true, and when we meet in London next spring, you will reward me for all I have done for you by walking out of a room before me." But all these honours, and, what was better, all the happiness that came in her way, Lady Ball accepted thankfully, quietly, and with an enduring satisfaction, as it became such a woman to do. End of Chapter 30. End of Miss Mackenzie, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Kirsten Wever.